Been educated. That was a small minority, but still. So they began to talk about this and say, well, the ancient world, that was wonderful. That's the ideal. That's what we want to go back to. And now, us modern people, that's good too, because we're living like the ancient people did. We're imitating that. And the stuff in the middle, well, we don't care about that. And that's where our terms, ancient, medieval, the Middle Ages, and modern came from. And they are a terrible handicap to talking about history now because they don't really make much sense, especially the medieval-modern division. But that's where they came from. That's why we use the words. So when people at the time used the term rebirth, and they were talking about rebirth of ancient Latin, and we'll talk about art a little bit later, this is what they meant, was that they were going to skip over all that stuff in the middle and go back to an ideal world in the past. Now, the thesis of my book, everything I've said so far, is not original to me. This is what historians in this field know and talk about. But I'm asking the question of why would they do that? Just talking about going back to Shakespeare's language, you can see that that would be a lot of trouble. Why would anybody decide that there's a place in time that's better than where I am now? I'm going to go back to there and I'm going to make believe that I'm there. And we have a quotation from Petrarch here in which you'll see him stating this kind of thing. And I think Maria, it's your turn. Number 7.
7, okay. I have 12 single
Mindedly.
That was a very hard word.
I'm sorry. Single-mindedly.
On learning about antiquity, among other things, because this age has always displaced me, so that unless love for dear once pulled the other way, I always wish to have been born in any other age whatever, and to forget this one, and I always try to transport myself mentally to other times.
Okay, so you can see in the quotation, he wants to escape from the present. He wants to live in another time. Now that means that something about the present must be quite horrible, quite frightening. Now the Renaissance has usually been portrayed as an age of perfection. All previous explanations of the Renaissance of what its causes are that I've ever encountered pick something good from today, something modern that they think began then. Last year, well, it's more than last year, 2013, a book came out called The Swerve, How the World Became Modern. And it won a Pulitzer Prize and a National Book Award. And its thesis is that during the Italian Renaissance, an ancient document by Lucretius, a poem, was discovered. And this poem it's a poem about science. And it's a scientific explanation of atoms and how the world is put together, and it's an explanation of nature without God. There is no reference to God in it. Now, what the humanists were really interested in this poem was the poetry and the language and how you could say these things. But this modern author has said is, aha, they are explaining the world without God. It's the beginning of secularism and the beginning of science. You've got to get rid of religion in order to have science, he says. And so this is the swerve, the point where the world took a turn towards modernity. But my explanation of and there are others of that sort. There are people who've said that civic participation was what caused the Renaissance. People who said individualism is what caused the Renaissance. I'm saying it's the bubonic plague and constant warfare. Terrible things, horrible things, that induced people to want to live in some other time, at least in their imagination. Now, in Northern Europe, where there was no Renaissance at this time, people have accepted this explanation for some very strange things in the culture. A lot of make-believe, a lot of... if you look at the Disney World castle, it doesn't look like a real castle. It's got all kinds of funny towers going in all directions. Well, they really built things like that at the time of the plague in Northern Europe because they were trying to live a fairy tale. This is where knights and ladies and dragons and witches and all the paraphernalia of Harry Potter and the Lord of the Rings, all of that was part of their culture because they were being escapists, because they had the plague, and they had the 100 Years' War, and terrible things like that. Well, Italy had these things too. So I'll ask, let's see, who's next? Oh, sorry. Joanne, would you read number 8 then? This is a description of, let me say what this is first. This is an individual, Agnolo de Tura, in Siena during the initial outbreak of the Black Death in 1348, describing his experience.
In this time began the great mortality, the greatest and most obscure and most horrible imaginable, and it lasted till October 1348. It was of such a secret character that men and women died almost without warning. A swelling appeared in the groin or the armpit, and while they were talking, they fell dead. The father would not attend to his son. One brother fled from the other. The wife abandoned her husband, for it was said that to catch the disease, it sufficed to look upon a victim or to feel his breath. And it must have been so indeed, since so many perished in the months of May, June, July, and August, that it was impossible to find anyone to bury the dead. Neither relatives, nor friends, nor priests, nor friars accompanied them to the grave, nor was the office of the dead recited. He who lost a relative or a housemate, as soon as the breath had left the body, took him by night or day, and with 2 or 3 to lend a hand, carried him to the church, and with his helpers buried the corpse as best he could, covering it with just enough earth to save it from the dogs. And in many places of the city, trenches were dug, very broad and deep, and into them the bodies were thrown and covered with a little earth, and thus layer after layer until the trench was full, and then another trench was commenced. And I, Agnolo de Tura, called Gracio, with my own hands buried 5 of my children in a single trench, and many others did the like. And many dead there were so ill covered that the dogs dug them up and ate them, dispersing their limbs through the city. And no bells rang, and nobody wept, no matter what is lost, because almost everyone expected death, and people believed and said, this is the end of the world.
They really did believe that God was wiping out the human race. There's another diary from Florence where the author of the diary died, and his nephew, I think it was, picked up the diary and continued it and said, I'm writing to record the extermination of mankind. We used to estimate that 1 out of 3 people in Europe died. You see it would be about 4 months in one place, but it was continually spreading. And it went on from 1347 all the way to 1352, which is when it reached Poland and Russia. But the later estimates are that at least half, possibly 60% of the population died. We can never know. All the world wars, the Holocaust, everything, never reached that kind of proportion. And it was a horrible, horrible death. Petrarch wrote, after it had passed Italy, he said, posterity will never believe that this happened. But what they soon discovered was that it was going to happen again and again and again and again, and that they would not be free from it. In fact, the last outbreak in Europe was in 1800-something. The last big one was in Moscow in a little after the American Revolution. But it kept coming back, and for a long time. Well, let's see, we're back to Marion. Would you read number 9?
So,
Yes. Oh, yes. Oh, sorry. Father Philip, I didn't know whether you were going to or not.
only the Black Death of 1347 to 1353 reached every corner of Europe in a single, rapidly moving outbreak, but many later visitations covered large regions or even vast swaths of the continent. Every year saw outbreaks somewhere in Europe, and every locality experienced plague again and again for at least the first 2 centuries of the second pandemic.
That's what this whole period is called. Sorry.
That's okay. From 1400 to 1600, the plague raged somewhere in Europe during every year but one. In Italy, Venice had an outbreak in 1357, but most of the peninsula was not ravaged again until 1361 to 1363, when the Pesta Segunda in Pisa, Pistoia, and Florence, among other places, killed on 69 to 1371. The Pesta Tertia took an additional 10 to 15%. These returning outbreaks disabused the population of any illusion that the Black Death was a single, unique phenomenon. People had to habituate themselves to a life that was far more frightening and precarious than before.
Okay, Lily, would you read the next one? This is Petrarch, a letter to Boccaccio.
The year 1348 was one of mourning for us. Now we realize that it is only the beginning of our mourning. For since then this evil force, unequaled and unheard of in human annals, through the centuries has never ceased, striking everywhere on all sides, on the left and right like a skilled warrior. And
you can see up here, plague is documented in Italy during at least 68% of the years from 1348 to 1600, which includes, of course, all of the Renaissance. Now, this was no secret. People have known about the Black Death for a long time, but as a history professor, I've used lots of textbooks, and what they usually do is they describe all of this at the end of the chapter on the Middle Ages. You turn the page, and you're in the Renaissance, and it will never be mentioned again. And they usually conclude by saying, well, it became less frequent over time, and you get the idea that it sort of faded away. Well, I have an appendix in the book which lists all these outbreaks in Italy so that people can visually see that it was a constant problem throughout the Renaissance. It does become more rare after 1550. The outbreaks are separated instead of by 2, 3, 5 years. They're separated by 10, 15, 20 years, but when they strike, the death rate is higher. We've all heard of the Great Plague of London, which was in 1664, which was the last big outbreak in London, and it was devastating, but they were becoming less frequent. And after well, there was a tremendous one in Marseille in 17 teens, and after that they do become rare and not so great. But that means that the entire period of the Renaissance is in the midst of this. Yes?
Doesn't the beginning of the plague actually mark the transition from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance?
Yes, it does. There's a lot of argument about just where you would draw that line, and I don't think there was a day when somebody woke up and said, now we're in the Renaissance. We're talking about Petrarch here, who was a witness. Boccaccio was a witness. They are the earliest humanists that people talk about as Renaissance humanists. So they are people who are there. Now, they had reasons to begin their need for escape even before the plague, because famine was becoming a problem. It had not been a problem in the High Middle Ages, but they had developed an overpopulation situation. There had been a huge population explosion in the Middle Ages. And so they were beginning to get overpopulated, and they were starting to have famines. And the year before 1348 was a famine year. And there were people, well, one witness, I'm not sure I believe him, one witness says people in Florence went out into the countryside and grazed on the grass. So things had taken a bit of a nosedive before the plague, and then of course this unbelievable disaster comes along. But you're right. Now, we haven't talked about art much because, for one thing, next week I'm going to talk about art. But one of the reasons is that this humanism predates the coming of Renaissance art by more than half a century. So you have the writers who are reviving ancient Roman Latin for a long time, and then friends of theirs who are in the arts begin to say, well, let's do the same thing in art. It's much more complicated than that, as we'll talk about next week. But the art movement is usually dated to 1401. There's a particular, you might know, the contest between Brunelleschi and Ghiberti for the doors of the Florentine baptistry. So there's a time lag there, but the mentality of escapism is operating in all of these areas.
Well, it would seem that I just think from, with my experience with archaeology, usually you see that a cultural change occurs. Any drastic cultural change occurs because of something that's changed.
That's
physically, the conditions, living conditions. And it would seem to really confirm what you're saying, is that if the late 14th century is that point of the beginning of famine and plague, that would definitely change the outlook afterwards.
Right.
And you mentioned art. One of the things that is very interesting to me with a background in printmaking is that Albrecht Dürer in 1498 made a fortune as an artist. And he made his fortune doing woodcuts illustrating the book of Revelation. And people always ask, why the book of Revelation? Because 1498 was 2 years before 1500, and 1500 was deemed to be the end of the world at the time. But I'm bringing and he made a fortune because then he was, after all the money he made, he was one of the top artists in Europe, and at least Northern Europe. But that too fits with what you're saying. That this whole idea of the end of the world, this all coming, that fits perfectly with what you're saying. Well, and why were they thinking it was? If
I'm right, the artwork you're talking about includes the four horsemen of the apocalypse.
Exactly.
And the chapter that I cover famine and plague and war in is entitled "The Four Horsemen."
Right.
Because I'm not talking about the war much because there's just so much time, but this was also a time of unceasing warfare and chaos politically in Italy. Okay, one reaction that people had, both in Northern Europe and in Italy, and you would expect this, is that they're going to think about death a lot. They're going to be, sometimes people kept skulls on their desks as a reminder of death. There was this morbid fascination. And here I've got to show you a picture. This is an example of an Italian Renaissance example of a subject that was very popular, the triumph of death. Now, I would submit that this is one of the most unchristian subjects you could possibly portray. And it is on the walls of a friary in Italy. These were typically painted in churches and in churchyards. And we see before this period, there was no skeleton used to symbolize death. There was no picture that meant death, because people were not fixated on it. But here we see this triumphal skeleton with the crown standing on the edge of a tomb. Inside the tomb is a pope and an emperor. And on one side, there's a skeleton shooting at people with bow and arrow. On the other side, there's one shooting with a brand new invention, would have been called a sciuperto at the time, but it's a gun. And at the bottom, we see the Doge of Venice and the king, and other important people offering up money. The king is trying to borrow money from a Jew to bribe death to stay away. And all the people in this picture are high-ranking people, because underneath it there is another type of picture called the Dance of Death, in which people from all walks of life are being danced off to death by decomposing or skeleton versions of themselves. Now, this art was popular. There was a cemetery in Paris called the Cemetery of the Innocents, where people would just go and socialize amidst all of this kind of art, which ringed the space. Bodies were buried in the middle until they were reduced to bones. Then they were dug up, and the bones were stored in big chambers above the walkways so that everybody could see all these bones. So this morbid reaction did not lead to the Renaissance, and much of this art and much of this expression has been lost or ignored. We have a poem to illustrate it. I think that's our next reading. Let's see. Is that Lily or? Yeah, we're back to Mary.
Wretches, look at this stone. Come inside and smell a little, you who take pleasure in this world. Vermin, stench, and dung is your place. Stink. You who perhaps an hour ago tasted to the full the sin you will be able to play at no more. What is it, mortal, that pleases your mind? Your body is grazed upon by all kinds of vermin that think you are nothing but a bad dinner. Born by Castellano de Castellani.
That's pretty awful stuff. It's really hard to imagine that books of that sold like hotcakes, and people just would sit around reading them because they were scared. And you know, one of the things that has left a permanent mark on our culture are these skeletons and things like that. One of the things that resulted from this was a terror of God. God was frightening. God was the one who was sending the plague. And it was extremely difficult for people to deal with that. The love of God faded into the background. The triumph of Christ over death was all but forgotten. This was a time when people didn't turn their back. It didn't do that, as far as I've been able to discover in the Eastern Church, and that's a very interesting question. I have some speculations about why it didn't do that. In the Eastern Church, the church was in bad shape, being persecuted, large areas conquered by the Muslims. The Byzantine Empire was tottering, and at times like that, people are, they cling to what they know and they don't change it. They stick with what gives them comfort and what is sure and safe. And this meant that, and this is something we are very conscious of in the Orthodox Church, this meant that change, away from Rome, in the town of Viterbo. And cardinals came there fleeing from Rome, who hadn't planned to be there. And so Pius ordered a tremendous celebration of the Corpus Christi feast. And There, each cardinal put on a different display, and the parade
اقبلني اليوم شريكا لعشائك السر يا ابن الله لأني لست أقول سرك لأعدائك ولا أعطيك قبلة غشة مثل يهوذا لكن كاللص أعترف لك